G'day everyone. I'm here today speaking with Peter Mitchell about his new book, I'll Walk Beside You, Love, Loss, the Burma Railway and the Human Spirit. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much, Warwick. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So first up, what can you tell us about I'll Walk Beside You?
Well, I Walk Beside You, which has just been published by Big Sky, is a sequel to Under the Same Moon, which was released about a year ago. And it follows, it's kind of a multifaceted story, but essentially it follows the lives of two brothers, Cal and Alan, who join a newly formed battalion in 1940 at the time of the fall of France. And a new division is being raised in Australia, and this battalion is part of it. But it follows Under the Same Moon follows their earlier lives pre-war, their time in the Melbourne University Rifles, a militia regiment which they joined in 1932. But it also traces the family lives, their family and the families of Cal's to become wife and Alan's fiance. And it also provides a lot of historical background. So pre-war, the preparations or lack thereof for war, the Depression period in Australia, what life was like then, and very much underpinned by huge amounts of correspondence, the past between, in particular, Cal and his wife Jean, but also other members of the family, and also after war broke out, friends of Cal's and his brother Alan when they were separated, with most of the battalion being in the Middle East. So at the end of Under the Same Moon, the battalion finds itself on a ship with another battalion, the 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, commanded by then Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Blackburn, and they're all alone. With the Japanese having entered the war and moving at speed down through Southeast Asia, the Allies hit the panic button and it's decided to send a couple of divisions of Australian troops back to the Pacific Theatre from the Middle East. Cal and Alan's ship is one of them, but it gets separated from the rest of the convoy. So we all know that Curtin and Churchill had this big standoff, and with Curtin winning to have the ships diverted to Australia rather than going to Singapore, to Burma. But unfortunately for Cal and Alan, their ship was a very fast, modern ocean-going passenger liner and moved way ahead of the rest of the convoy and hit the Netherlands East Indies before that decision had been made. So we pick up I'll Walk Beside You with the men on the ship subjected to an uncertain fate. Will they be ordered to disembark, or will sense prevail and they be ordered to rejoin the rest of the convoy and go to Australia? And so the story in I'll Walk Beside You unfolds from there. No spoilers, but they're ordered to disembark, a foolish decision. And as the guest speaker at the launch of the book last month, Professor Joan Beaumont, said, it was a woeful decision. And while we all laud Curtin for standing up to Churchill, he certainly dropped the ball on this one. And it's a hopeless cause. Everyone knows from the highest levels of government and military in both Australia and the UK, and even in the Netherlands, that Java can't be defended, but nevertheless they're ordered to disembark for reasons of prestige and not upsetting the Dutch. And they ended up on the Burma Railway. And so there's about 3.5 years, and there's a lot of, through the letters, a lot of story as well about the lives at home, with the families not knowing where their men are for years, literally.
Okay, so it's all based on fact and personal letters and diaries.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
And
So it's total. Yeah.
Yep. So it's written as what they call a historical narrative sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe if I could go into why I wrote it the way I did, Warwick.
yeah. Yep.
Because yes, so it's all fact. Um, so my parents died within a short time of each other, and shortly after that, I moved to Singapore, and everything, all of their papers, I couldn't go through all of their effects before I moved to Singapore, and it wasn't until I returned to Australia a long time later, during the COVID period, that I had the opportunity to sort of go through the remainder of their effects. And there are literally hundreds of letters, covering the period 1939 and 1945. My father also recorded his life story on old cassette tapes, about 15 hours worth. He wrote memoirs, unpublished. Some of his friends also wrote memoirs. One of his friends kept a diary right through the war, including the time in captivity, which he managed to keep away from the Japanese. And these were the main primary sources that I used for the book. So as I was going through this material, the letters in particular are very densely written, sometimes hard to read, and the subject matter probably for somebody today isn't all that interesting in that form, at least. So I decided, I felt, when I go, probably a lot of this material, probably all of it will be chucked out. And I wanted to preserve this story. It's a very important part of family history, for my children, grandchildren, and descendants and broader family. And so I hit on the idea of writing it up as story. So essentially, what my editor described as creative nonfiction. So
That's the
sort of in
one.
the form
Yep.
of a novel. So there's dialogue there, which jars with some professional historians, understandably, but it's all the dialogue is sort of comes out of as the guest speaker at the launch put it. My imagination was anchored by all of these sources, so it's not wildly out of place dialogue in my opinion. And as I again got further and further into it, particularly in relation to the subject matter of I'll Walk Beside You, which is just full of instances of heroism and stoicism, almost or bravery on a daily basis, exhibited by just ordinary everyday people, not just on the railway and at war, but the people at home as well. And I thought this is a story that really needs to be sent out to a wider audience. And so I thought, I should get it published, and I thought this form of creative nonfiction, writing it as story, and not as a kind of a pure history book, if you like, was actually a good form, because the current generation of Australians don't have any direct connection with the war, of course, and unless they're historians, uh, they're not going to know too much about it, if anything. And if they're not historians, they won't think of picking up a history book. So perhaps therefore something written in this form might actually get out there to a wider audience than the sort of pure history community, and people might get to know something about that period. And I was quite gratified last year when I was doing a number of talks around the country for the previous book, that I had people coming up afterwards and saying, "Look, I didn't know too much. I knew there was a depression, but I didn't know anything about it. And this is fascinating. I'm going to kind of look into it more." And other people said, "Look, my father or grandfather was in the Middle East, and he never spoke about it, and I didn't know what he did. But this has got me going, and I'm going to find out, what he did." So anyway, that's my hope, and that's why I wrote it the way I did. But it's all totally underpinned by fact in that source material that I mentioned.
Yeah. So people get a good story and they learn something on the way.
Yes, with
Yeah.
hopefully.
Hopefully. Okay. Okay. So we'll go to the action in Java, because it's a really underreported event for Australians.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the situation in Java, and why were they there? As you already mentioned that their ship docked there. Um,
Mm.
but what was the situation around Java at the time, and did they ever really have any hope?
No, so answer your last question first. No, they had no hope. Um, the 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 General Wavell, at the beginning of February, was the sort of supreme Allied commander of what was called the ABDA Command, America, British, Dutch, Australian, and all of the senior military figures essentially including Wavell, but particularly the Australian military figures such as the Australian Chief General Staff, General Sturdy, in Australia, General Laverack, who was the then head of One Australia Corps, and in Sumatra and Java for a brief time with Brigadier Berryman. They were all of the view, as I say, particularly Sturdy and Laverack, that Java was completely a lost cause. And their assessment of the Dutch land forces was that they were abysmal, which is quite right. The Dutch army was about 25,000, mainly locals of questionable loyalty and commanded by Dutch officers, but they were their air force was just not up to the task. Either the planes were very inferior to the Japanese, the pilots had very little training. So the assessment was that Java could not be defended. The Japanese, interestingly, they sent some people to the Dutch East Indies pre-war in 1940, and their secret mission was to assess the defences of the Netherlands East Indies. And they reported back to Tokyo that if they could roll the place in 2 days, it was so poorly defended, which turned out to be pretty much correct. So why were they left there? Sturdy was furious because he implored the Australian War Cabinet. He said, look, obviously this shipload of Australian troops is part of the convoy to which the overall order to return ships to Australia relates. It applies to that ship as much as anything. And Laverack was of the same view. He described the ultimate decision to leave the men there as a in quote flagrant betrayal. The reason why they were left there was, as I touched on just before, it was a matter of British prestige. They felt that they had to show some sort of support for the Dutch and not just leave them in the lurch. So all of these, kind of fairly specious reasons were applied, and that's why the men disembarked. And they didn't have any. They hardly had any weapons. So the machine gun battalion had no machine guns. They were on another ship. The Callan Allen's battalion, the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, didn't have enough rifles to go around and only had about 10 rounds for each rifle. And they had actually been, the day before they disembarked in Java, they'd been told to disembark in Sumatra because the British had been told that the Japanese had invaded to the north of Sumatra. And so these men, without any weapons, were ordered to go forth, to march north and take on the Japanese and push them back. And it was just madness.
Okay. And how many men are we talking? Hundreds of thousands? Or?
About just under 3,000. And so the two main units were the 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, as I said, who were a bit over 700, and the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, a bit over 900. Also, Weary Dunlop's Casualty Clearing Station was on the ship. They were numbered around 90. And the rest were, almost half were dribs and drabs, like engineers, cooks, guards battalions, so non-combatants. So apart from those, the pioneers and the machine gunners, they're all non-combatants. So, so when they were ordered to disembark, the first order was to defend the 5 airfields around Batavia, modern-day Jakarta.
Yep.
But there weren't any planes pretty much by then. They'd all been knocked out. So, but that was, and so Blackburn was promoted to brigadier to command the 2,900 men. He formed the brigade, the force into a brigade, as known as Black Force, and Laverack had gone. The other senior Australian military officers had gone. Wavell had disbanded ABDA and cleared off as well, and the Australians were put under the command of a Dutch general.
Okay.
This is a abysmal situation.
Yeah. So you mentioned Arthur Blackburn there. So he's VC from World War One.
Yes.
In the letters and the diaries, do you get an idea of how the troops felt about being under his command? Do they make much mention
Um,
of it, or?
yeah, not the family letters and diaries, Warwick, but I did a lot of research on Blackburn, who's clearly a much loved and respected figure, and the clearly the men of the Second, Third Machine Gun Battalion revered him.
Okay.
And
Okay.
sorry, just to interrupt, just to
Yep.
conclude on that, but my own assessment of how he brought this force together and how that force performed in Java, it's obviously is far be it for me to say, but obviously an absolute credit to Blackburn, and the Australians just fought incredibly well in this
Yeah.
battle.
Yeah. So this battle, which I'll leave the pronunciation up to you because I've got no idea. um, what can you tell us about this battle?
Can I just, is it possible for me to read something out from Joan Beaumont's speech at the launch
Yeah.
about this
Yeah.
battle
Yeah.
before I go into it?
Yeah.
And then I'll just describe why they were fighting there. But she, so yeah. So we see, she says, today we hear a lot about Prime Minister John Curtin's refusal in early 1942 to allow Australian troops returning from the Middle East to be diverted, as Churchill wanted to Burma. But we hear far less about Curtin's decision to allow some Australian troops to be diverted to Java to support the Dutch troops' hopeless task of defending the Dutch colonial possessions of the Netherlands East Indies. The decision to support the Dutch, made in early 1941 and not really reviewed thereafter, was a largely political one. The forces on Java had no chance of success given the Japanese dominance of air and sea after the sinking of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse only days after Pearl Harbor. The decision to send the Australians to Java, then like the deployment of unequipped and unsupported Australian battalions on Ambon and Dutch Timor, was a woeful one that I think can only explain in terms of, as the dominance of emotion over reason and a lingering and misplaced faith in European imperial power. As Peter says, the Battle of Lawiliang, and as Joan says, many of us might say the Battle of Ware, because national memory is a very selective process, giving provenance to some episodes of the past and not others, was not properly recognised at the time, and it continues to be forgotten, not least because I think there remains some unease at the official levels about the decisions of 1942 and the lasting sense of betrayal that the troops felt at being placed not only by Wavell but Curtin in such a hopeless situation. So, but as Lawiliang has been forgotten, it was, as Peter shows, a battle in which Australians displayed remarkable fortitude, perseverance, courage, and resilience. So, shall I go on to describe what the battle was about?
Yep. Yep. That's good.
I think it's a good background that Joan provides there.
Yeah. That's a good summary.
Yeah. So the everyone knows the Japanese are going to invade Java. They've already taken over Sumatra, and Blackburn, the senior British general Sitwell, and the Dutch all agree that that they're no doubt going to invade at the northwest of the island at least, which is the closest point from Sumatra. Blackburn concludes that Lawiliang is in Western Java, near to the west of modern-day Bogor, which in turn is to the west of modern-day Bandung, and southeast of modern-day Jakarta. So they get probably a brief sort of snapshot of where it is. It's a very small. It's still there under the name of Lawiliang today. A very small place. But Blackburn reconnoitred Western Java. There were two main roads: one that ran along the north coast through Batavia, and another which was it's called the Great Post Road. That was a southern road that ran through this town Lawiliang, which is on a big river, and there was a 70-yard steel bridge. I think it was 70-yard steel bridge across the river. Blackburn felt that the Japanese were likely to thrust principally along the southern road because the northern road along the coast was densely populated. There were lots of irrigation channels. It was still the wet season, very, very hard to for mobile troops to get through quickly. And so he decided to station his force, Black Force, at a tea plantation just to the east of Lewiliang. And the Dutch were to support Black Force. And in fact, the plan was for the Dutch to run a sort of a holding operation of taking the Japanese on when they landed, but because the Dutch knew as well that their army was pretty hopeless, that they would just keep on pulling back and not directly engage. And as they pulled back along rivers, they blow up the bridges and try and stall the Japanese advance. And then the main point of resistance was going to be this big river and the town of Lewiliang and the bridge. And there the Dutch would support the Australian Black Force, the 2,900 men, on the flanks on each side. Blackburn's plan, having been told how the Japanese had operated in Malaya, was not to be totally defensive, but take the attack to the Japanese. The Japanese had become masters at as kind of a central attack, but flanking manoeuvres as well to try and encircle the enemy. So Blackburn set up his defences on the basis that he would have a central force, but he'd have the Dutch and his own companies on the flanks as well to repel the Japanese. The idea of taking the fight to the Japanese across the bridge and further into Western Java was knocked on the head when the Dutch retreated without blowing up bridges or anything. They just scarpered as soon as the Japanese invaded. And much to Blackburn's annoyance, because it meant that he had very little time to set up his defences properly at Lewiliang. And it was his idea of being a mobile offensive force was finally knocked on the head when the Dutch blew up the bridge at Lewiliang. So Blackburn couldn't move. He was just stuck there,
So the one bridge they blew up was the escape route.
Yeah. So and the Japanese had also landed in central Java, and they were threatening the Dutch capital and the Dutch military headquarters at Bandung. So they told Blackburn they were pulling out, and so they sort of scarpered to central Java, to Bandung, and left Blackburn's force, 2,900 men, at the mercy of a Japanese division of 20,000 with artillery, mortars, air support, etc. So, and this is where it's a great Australian military story, because these guys they held out for about 3 or 4 days. They were pounded. Blackburn had, in addition to his 2 main fighting units, the machine gunners and the Pioneer Battalion, he had a section of Texan artillery. He had a British squadron of obsolete tanks, but the Japanese kept on trying to get around him by going further and further down the left flank, and he kept on sending companies down to repel them and in fact force them back across the other side of the river. But he knew that this was in effect widening his front, and that he really couldn't hang on here forever. And then he got orders from the Dutch. He was reporting to the Dutch that Bandung was under threat. Everyone in the Dutch army was pulling back to Bandung, and could he hold on for another 24 hours so the Dutch could get away? And then he should. So Blackburn said he would, but he knew that meant he had to pull back as well, because he in the end he would be swamped. So that was they withdrew successfully, and needless to say, any Australian involved in that action was not terribly enamoured with the support that was offered by the Dutch.
Yeah. Okay, so they held on for 3 to 5 days against overwhelming odds. What was the what brought about the end?
So when the Australians first landed, as I mentioned, the British commander was a chap called Sitwell. There was Brigadier Blackburn, and the Dutch commanders, their senior commander was a guy called Terputten, and the idea was that they would the Allied forces would probably be pushed back to Bandung ultimately, and that's where they would make a last stand. Anyway, the Dutch, as I say, had made a lot of distance running backwards to Bandung in a very short time. Sitwell and Blackburn had discussed, the possibility of the Dutch surrendering, and what would they do if the Dutch surrendered? Would they fight on or not? And Sitwell had been given orders from Wavell. Firstly, don't expect any help from outside. There'll be, it's up to you to sort yourselves out. There'll be no rescue or anything for you. But if the Dutch give up, try and evacuate. So that was Sitwell's order. But to keep on fighting for as long as the Dutch do, and then make your own arrangements. When the Dutch capitulated, they ordered the Australians and the British to also surrender, and the British and Australians chose not to. And Blackburn had plans to go up into the mountains and continue, blowing up bridges and kind of destroying roads as they went, but to continue the fight in the southern mountains of Western Java. And Sitwell, the British commander, said he would do the same. However, the Dutch got very upset with this because blowing up bridges was annoying the Japanese and affecting their surrender negotiations, their terms of capitulation. And the British surrendered. And Blackburn intended to keep on going, but his medical staff, his senior medical officer, just said, we've been speaking to the local Dutch. It's not possible to survive in these mountains. The men are just, their health is just going to get smashed, and it's just not feasible to fight from the mountains. There are no medical supplies. There are no sources of food in the mountains. It's not going to work. So, for the sake of the men, Blackburn decided that the Australians too, would have to surrender.
Yep. So at this stage, they weren't particularly aware of what surrender to the Japanese actually meant, were they?
No, and no, they weren't. But the fact of surrendering, it's like every soldier's nightmare. They were kind of smashed. They did have to surrender, and they were just really bitter that they were put into this situation. Firstly, by having been ordered to land when everyone knew it was hopeless, and then by the performance of the Dutch forces in not offering any support.
Yep. Okay, so they surrender, and then they're taken prisoner. They're prisoners of war. Are they immediately shipped to Burma, or?
No. So for a while, that they're sent for a short time to a town not far away from Bandung called Lellis, and they're all put up in the marketplace in this town, and it was a bit of a false dawn, really, because there was plenty of food. They could move around, not too many guards. But from there, they were sent to old Dutch army barracks in Batavia, Jakarta, called the Basketball Camp, and they were there for about 6 months, and things got pretty nasty then. Firstly, because the senior officers were rounded up by the Japanese Gestapo, the Kempeitai, and taken away for a month's torture and interrogation because the Japanese just didn't believe that such a tiny force could have held them up for so long. And they also wanted a lot of information about Australia. And so the book goes into this, but these guys, and in particular the commander of the Pioneer Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, were really badly tortured during that interrogation period. The other, or particularly bad spot, was that the Japanese wanted the Australians to sign a kind of um, an agreement that they wouldn't try to escape and wouldn't essentially wouldn't cause any trouble, and they all refused to sign it. And it got to a point where the Japanese were on the point of uh, taking prisoners away to be shot. A lot of prisoners have been badly beaten up because of this refusal to sign. And eventually Blackburn had to he sent an order out to say, look, just sign. You're signing it under duress, so it means nothing. But, we for the sake of everyone's lives and health, you've got to sign.
Yep. Okay. So in the book, there's the story, the love story in there as well. So there's letters going back and forth.
Yeah.
So when Jean stops receiving letters, do we get an idea of how that was for her?
Yes. So the last letter that Cal received from Jean was one that she sent that he received in the Middle East, and is dated December 1941. And so, with one exception, he pretty much didn't receive any further letters from her for the rest of the war. His last letter to her, he wrote on the ship sailing out from the Middle East to the Netherlands East Indies, and it was posted in Colombo. That was dated February 1942. And that was really the last meaningful communication that he sent until the end of the war. They had these letter cards, I'm sure you know, which were received a couple of years later. But Jean kept on writing in early 1942 because she didn't know that they'd left the Middle East, so she was sending all these letters and packages over to him, and eventually they'd all be sent back to her, marked delivering impracticable, return to sender. And so that for some months they didn't know where they were. She kept on writing, and then finally, in sort of mid-1942, she received a telegram to say that he was alive but a prisoner in Java. So that's when they knew where they were.
Yeah. So she didn't even know he was fighting the Japanese.
No, no, she thought that they were still in Palestine.
Oh, wow. Okay. 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 So he ends up on the Burma Railway. Is that the main focus of the book? And what does I'm assuming he's taken from his diary entries, which so he's keeping a diary itself as a bit of an act of bravery.
Yeah, so Cal didn't, but one of his friends did, and also their commanding officer did, Lieutenant Colonel Williams. And I mean, this guy is it was one of my great discoveries. I mean, I knew of Williams, but I didn't appreciate how heroic he was. In fact, I came across a combined Pioneer Battalion's newsletter issued in 2005, like 21 years ago, and the heading was "An Outstanding Australian," and it was all about Williams, and he's mentioned in the kind of the same paragraph as Dunlop in relation to his record on the Burma Thai Railway, but he's now sort of completely forgotten. But I drew a lot from his diary, and let's say the diary of one of Cal's friends who was with him on that Burma end of the railway as well.
Okay. And does the diary give a lot of detail about the day-to-day life? And so we know obviously of the brutality and that, but outside of that, do you get an idea of just the day-to-day life in the camp?
Yes, I do work. It's fascinating. I mean, I knew I knew about it to a degree, just because of talking, father talking, and he was quite fortunate because his way of coping with what he endured after the war was to talk about it, and he was encouraged to talk about it. So I knew quite a bit about it, but William's diaries and Kevin Nolan's diaries that he kind of formed the basis of a book that he wrote about 30, 40 years ago. yeah, are fascinating in relation to day-to-day life.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So after the war, they've come back home,
Mhm.
and that's often where the story ends, as far as historians are concerned, and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing. What was it actually like coming back to Australia after suffering what they'd done at the hands of the Japanese?
Yeah. So I'm working on that. I found it interesting. So under the same, sorry, I'll Walk Beside You carries on. You asked me before, is it all about the railway? Well, I found the post-recovery period quite, really interesting. Um, and they recovered. They a lot of them were sent to Bangkok for treatment and testing and recovery. And the government sent recovery teams into Thailand. And what comes out clearly is these recovery teams were not necessarily all that sympathetic. And I've delved a lot. I have been delving a lot into this, and it was by design. I mean, they were ordered, not to treat these guys as anything special.
Okay.
Yeah, and the first time they felt sort of empathy or sympathy was when they were moved from Bangkok to Singapore just prior to sailing out back to Australia. When they were put into the clutches of the Red Cross, who treated them like as they felt they ought to be treated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is out beyond the scope of I'll Walk Beside You, but it's quite clear in talking to family members and again listening to my father's tape recordings and sort of other direct evidence that there certainly was a difference in Australia for these guys coming back between ex-servicemen um, walking, in life, everyone getting sort of assimilated back into the community. So talking to an ex-serviceman as opposed to talking to somebody who'd never been away. And it wasn't so, I wouldn't say it was meanness, but it was a complete lack of understanding of what these guys had been through. And there's a very interesting article written by a woman, I think her name is Betty Peters, who was in part of the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital, and she wrote a very interesting essay about 30 years ago on returned servicemen from the widow's or wife's perspective,
Okay.
um, and how hard it was for them because of this, uh, you know, inability to understand what these guys had gone through. They sort of stepped away from. They found it hard, but they natural human thing to do, but they gravitated to their own kind, the RSL, you know, all that
Yeah.
stuff, and so it was difficult. Again, my father, as one example, he was given a voucher to buy a suit, but clothing was really severely rationed. There wasn't much material around, so I think it took him about eight. He had a fitting, but it took about 6 months to get a suit after he returned. But so all he had to walk around in was his uniform, and
Okay.
that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Depending upon
Yeah.
who he was talking to, and he had to say,
Okay.
apologize, like I'm not wearing this because I would want to. It's just I've got nothing else to wear.
Nothing else.
Um, he'd go into a pub to get some beer, and they say, look, bugger off, beer's um, rationed, and you're not a local. And he said, well, I will be, but I've been away for 4 years. And he said, oh,
Oh,
stiff.
jeez. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've never been good at getting our soldiers home, have we?
No.
Yeah, we're still not, but that's a
Mm,
different story. Um,
yeah.
okay, so what would you hope the readers will get out of this book? A bit of an understanding of the personal side of it as well as the history.
Yeah, look, I've told it without any editorializing. I think there are lots of obvious takeaways, from just telling the story and telling it in a very factual sense. So, um, I really hope that people, I've mentioned Williams before, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, so he's totally forgotten. So I hope people really understand, get to know this name sort of is resurrected somewhat, and
Yep.
people see just what he was a truly heroic figure. The other thing, which sort of goes to me the core of what Anzac Day is really all about, and and it's terrible to see even school principals object to Anzac Day because they think it glorifies war. It's nothing of the sort. So when you look at what these guys went through for 3 or 4 years, those that survived, supporting each other, and sort of anonymous acts of heroism, like men volunteering to act as orderlies in the cholera huts because the doctors are overworked. It's like a death sentence, and pretty bad, rotten death sentence. Just stuff like that. As I say, it's just ordinary old Joes, everyday acts of bravery that we don't know who these people are, but I just really hope that gets out there.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Well, that sounds awesome. Okay. So thank you for joining us today. I hope everybody gets out and reads the book. I do have a copy here, but when I hold it up to the camera, it's all backwards. So, and it's all bookshops and
Yep.
online ebooks
Yep.
and that sort of stuff. Okay, all right.
Indeed.
So I'll put a link in the show notes, and yeah, hopefully we'll get some people to come and read it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Warwick.
Okay,
Let's
thank
hope
you.
so.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks very much, Warwick.